Hey, what's up you guys, it's Connor, and today I'm going to be doing a book review for In Cold Blood by Truman Capote. If you guys don't know, In Cold Blood is the first true crime novel. Truman Capote spent 4-ish years writing it and collecting information and interviewing all the people that were involved. He wanted to take a true story and a true crime and tell it using literary devices to make it more compelling and everything like that. This is actually the first book that I'm reading for my Capote Reading project, so I'm going through most of Truman Capote's works and doing reviews for them, and then I'll do one overall video talking about Capote. If you guys don't know, In Cold Blood is about the Clutters murder, which is a murder of a family, 2 parents and 2 of their children in Holcomb, Kansas in November of 1959. Herb and Bonnie and their 2 children were at home and were murdered by Perry Smith and Dick Hickok. This tells that story and it follows the murderers as they were plotting to go and rob the Clutters and everything that happens with that, as well as it follows the investigators that were trying to track down the killers and find out who murdered the Clutters. It also follows different townspeople from Holcomb, and it also follows the Clutters before they were murdered. And then it also follows all of those people after the murder happens. Obviously, because there's murder and this actually happened in real life. Not everything in here is completely accurate, but the actual event and a lot of the facts, the bare bones of this, did happen, so it could potentially be triggering for people. Some of the people in my law and literature class found that it was more scary knowing that these people existed and that these things actually happened. So there could be some trigger warnings for murder and brutal violence and also potentially pedophilia. And the last things I'll say before I get into my pros, cons, and rating is that this is told in alternating perspectives. So it goes from following the murderers for a little bit and then the family and then people from the town and then the investigators, and it switches time periods as well. All of that is done almost in a way to bring the tension up and to drive the novel forward. You don't really get what actually happens in the house until about 70% through the novel. You don't know for sure what happens. You see the bodies, I guess, but you don't actually know exactly what happens until later on when the murderers are describing the events of that night. And also, this is a non-fiction novel, although there are some things that people have said are not true, so you don't know exactly how much is true and how much is false. We'll never know, but let's get started. My first pro for this book is that it is a very full-rounded novel, a full-rounded account of what happens. You follow all of these different characters surrounding this tragedy, and then afterwards, it is so detailed that you really get to know every single character. You feel like you knew the Clutters. You feel like you know the murderers, especially because you spend the most time with them as they're fleeing and going around and doing whatever they're doing. You also feel like you just kind of know this town, that this town is a town that everyone leaves the front door unlocked and everyone is safe, and then this really shakes their world. I also like that this is the complete story. It goes from before the murders happen to the murder and then what happens afterward to the very end. So you really get to know everything that happens during this event. So I thought that it was just really compelling and really interesting in that regard, and the detail is what let you feel that way. There's so many little details that give you little hints into how the, I want to say, characters are thinking, even though they're real people. He does a lot of characterization in this. These people did exist, but we don't know exactly how closely they were characterized to how they were in real life. So I'm going to call them characters in this. So don't take offense by that. I actually listened to most of this as an audiobook and I really enjoyed the narration. I think that the narrator did a lot of different voices for the different characters involved, and I could really pick out which character it was without even knowing which character was talking. Like, just based off of the narrator's voice, I knew exactly which character it was, especially Perry and Dick. You could definitely tell them apart from the rest of the people in the novel. I've seen in other people's reviews that they really did not like the audiobook, that it was a bit of a slog to get through, and I think that the amount of detail is what contributes to the audiobook being very long. I think it was like 16 hours or something like that, but if you listen to audiobooks sped up, it makes it a lot easier to get through. So I listened to this on 1.65 speed, and that was the perfect speed for me, where I was getting all the details and I wasn't missing anything, but I was making a lot of progress in the novel. I touched on this already, but I think that Capote did a really good job of characterization in this book. Besides everything that I've already said, you really get the histories of each character, especially the murderers, because Capote spent a long time with the murderers, with Perry and Dick, and finding out their life stories and everything like that, and how they interacted with people in their lives. So you find out a lot about Perry and Dick and their histories and why they are the way that they are and how they came into the position to pull off this murder theft. You also get little hints into their thinking process and how different they think than everyday people. Even though they do these terrible, horrible things, they will call other people crazy. People that they were in prison with, they will call them crazy and they think that they are normal. They always try to make themselves seem more normal than they really are. It just showed that the characters had really low self-awareness and that they did not see themselves like everyone else saw them. And that can be said for everyday people. Most people don't actually know how other people view them, and most people aren't as self-aware as they tend to like to think that they are. And you can really see that in this novel, that a lot of the characters, especially Perry and Dick, don't see themselves the way that the world sees them. And so in my law and literature class, we were talking about how human that is. Because a lot of people will try to take murderers and thieves and everything like that and try to other them and make them seem less human. But I think that in this book it does a really good job of making them human and relatable, which is super weird because they murdered almost an entire family. The Clutters were survived by their two eldest daughters who were not living at the house at the time of the murder taking place. It just showed that they are flawed humans that do irrational actions. Richard Dick Hickok is a white American, and in the novel is portrayed as generally very charismatic, and that's how he's getting away with all the things that he does. And Perry Smith was a half Native American with a very, very troubled past. He has a very terrible upbringing and a very complicated family life, and you find out all about that in the novel. The main investigator that you follow is a guy named Alvin Dewey, and you follow his thought processes during all of these events, and you follow the effect that it has on him and his family and just all of that stuff. He's the main driving force behind trying to find out who the murderers were and why they murdered the Clutters, because the Clutters were viewed as a very prominent and well-liked family in this town of Holcomb. One of my favorite parts about this novel was Floyd Wells and finding out his role in everything that was happening. He was the bridge between these murderers and the Clutters. He's the one that told them about the house. And he has some very sketchy relations to this crime because he gives a lot of information that a lot of people wouldn't naturally have about the Clutters. At the beginning of the novel, you find out that the Clutters are very reserved people. A lot of the people that work on their farm do not know the inside of the house because people don't go in there. It's a very private area. But Floyd Wells has insider knowledge of how the house is laid out, which makes you think that he was maybe planning to rob the Clutters at some point and then gives all that information to Dick. It just kind of makes the crime seem a lot more complicated than what it's portrayed to have been. Also, more recently, I think that there was a journal, I think that Dick had written, that also says that the crime was more complicated than what people know. So I'm curious to see what happens with that and if there's more that comes out of that. Because there's also unanswered questions about these two individuals, like if they were involved with a very similar murder that happened in Florida while they were in Florida. So there are a lot of unanswered questions, and I am looking forward to seeing what happens with that because they recently exhumed their bodies, I believe is what I read, and got some DNA evidence to compare it to the crime that happened in Florida. But then the last pro that I'm going to talk about is that I really enjoyed reading about the trial. I feel like this was the most real trial that we were reading about in my law and literature class so far, because this trial actually happened. At the trial, the state attorney is going after Perry and Dick and trying to get the death sentence. In the United States, there are 3 different theories when it comes to psychology and capital punishment. One of the main defenses to capital punishment is that the criminal, the person who does the killing, because you can only get capital punishment if you murder someone, was insane at the time of the murder happening, or is insane in general. And insanity isn't what people generally think of as insanity. There is a legal insanity, and then there is just regular insanity. And the only one that matters is legal insanity in the legal system. And not every mental illness is able to get you a verdict of having insanity and not being culpable for your actions. The first one is McNaughton, which is named after a guy that killed someone when he was trying to kill someone else. And that theory basically is about the criminal at the time of the event. Did they know right from wrong? If they knew right from wrong, then they're guilty and they get capital punishment if the jury so chooses. If they did not know right from wrong, they can't be held accountable for that, and so they get the insanity defense. So all that matters is if you know right from wrong. It doesn't matter if you're able to control yourself, just that you knew right from wrong, and that's what happens in this book. There is a psychologist that comes into the trial and has to give his opinion, but he's not allowed to really explain his opinion, and so you don't get that information in the trial, which affects the outcome, but we get the information in the novel because the psychologist gave their evaluations to Capote to include. The second one that some states do is volitional. So basically you knew right from wrong, but you weren't able to control yourself, and you didn't do the crime of your own volition, basically having an uncontrollable impulse to kill someone. This one gets tricky because a lot of psychologists get involved in that, and it ends up being a lot of expert testimony, and the experts are the ones that really influence jury's decision when it comes to capital punishment. If an expert is telling you that this person could not resist doing this action, you're more likely to let them get off with a lesser sentencing, like life in prison, than to give them capital punishment, give them the death penalty for something that they couldn't control. So there are mixed feelings about that. And the last approach is the Durham approach, which isn't used in any states anymore. That was basically where juries could decide if they thought that the person was insane or not. And that one's been totally thrown out. People don't use that anymore. But I thought it was really interesting that these different approaches to psychologists coming into trials and giving expert testimony really affect what happens in the trial and what happens in sentencing and everything like that. So I was loving the trial in this because you get to see into the defense attorney's defense thoughts and why they do the things that they do and why they don't do certain things. And then you also see the state prosecutor's side where they're going for the capital punishment, the death penalty, and they're trying to paint these men in two different lights. I think that's one of my favorite things about reading about different trials is the prosecutors and the defense attorneys going and trying to paint the same event in two different ways that will hopefully get their client or their adversary a certain type of punishment. And the last thing that I'll touch on with the trial aspect was that I thought it was really interesting how they went about choosing the venue, which is where the trial is held, as well as the jury members. The way that Capote paints everything is very biased, and it really hints at the fact that Perry and Dick didn't get proper defense. They were put very close to where the event happened, and all of the people on the jury were people that at least knew of the Clutters. And one of the jury members says that he's against capital punishment, but in this case, he could see himself voting the other way, which just implies that he's already decided what he thinks about these men and what he thinks that they should get. So I thought all of that was very interesting. Now I'm going to talk about a couple of cons that I had. My first con is that this novel does get very bogged down in details. It almost seems like Capote included everything that he got. I know that's not true because he spent a very long time researching and pulling this novel together, but it just seemed like every time he had a whim and wanted to research something, he ended up including it. And so there's a ton of extra detail, which I know will bog people down, and it creates a very slow pace for this novel. Like I said, you don't get what actually happens that night until 3/4 of the way through the novel. So a lot of people tend to get very bored with it, but I think that all that extra detail really helps with the characterization of the two murderers and of the different people of the town. So it was almost like a pro and a con, but it definitely is slow. My really only other big con was all of the inaccuracies that have come out since this novel was published. One of the biggest ones is that Perry isn't portrayed as accurately as he was in real life. It seems like Truman Capote kind of inserted himself into the character of Perry and gave Perry a lot of his own attributes. In the book, Perry is almost like a pseudo-intellectual and really wants to have good grammar and good knowledge of words and everything like that. And apparently that's not really how Perry was. Capote really formed a really close bond with Perry and these two murderers because he spent so much time with them. And Perry and Capote had a lot of commonalities. For instance, they both were not very educated traditionally, and they were self-taught and everything like that. So there was a lot of connections between those two. It's also rumored that Capote had feelings for Perry and everything like that, so we don't actually know how accurate that depiction is. Two of the people that are in the novel, Sue and Alvin Dewey, said that the last scene of the book didn't actually happen. I won't reveal it in case you want to read it, but apparently that scene didn't happen at all. A lot of the people from the town say that the characterization of the people from the town weren't accurate, so the different random people that have perspective in this novel aren't true to how they were, or at least the people say it's not true to how they are. So maybe they just didn't like how they were depicted, or maybe they really aren't like that. Another person that says that it wasn't exactly accurate is the defense attorneys. In the novel, Capote portrays the lesser experienced defense attorney as the more dominant one, the one that worked more on the case, and apparently the more experienced attorney said that that's not really how that happened, and he worked very hard on that case, and that he was the main driving force of the defense. So there are just a lot of inconsistencies with this, and people say that it's not exactly true, but reading all of those things makes me question other things that are in the novel. So I don't know exactly how accurate it is and how true it is, although Capote says that everything that happens in this is very true. One thing that I looked up was that Capote, when he interviewed people, wouldn't actually write anything down as he was interviewing them. He said that he had perfected his memory so that he could recall everything very accurately. He practiced, apparently, where he would have someone say something to him and then he'd go into the next room and write it down, and then they would compare a recording of it versus what he'd written until he got to like 99% accurate, and he said that that was good enough. And the last thing that I'll say is that there is a neutral about the criticism of Capote and his role with the murderers. As I said, he became very, very close with them, and they didn't have a lot of money for their defense. They were supplied defense attorneys by the state. Some people criticize Capote that he got so close he injected himself into these guys' lives and then didn't really help them, and there is a rumor that he said at one point that he needed them to be executed so that he could finish the novel and publish it and it would be more successful. So there's some sketchy things that happen with that. Don't know if that's accurate at all. That's just what some people have said and that I've been reading as I was researching Capote and this novel in particular. So it's a bit of a mixed bag, because on the one hand, he is a journalist, or was a journalist, and this was supposed to be a nonfiction novel where he was interviewing people and all of that, but he put in so much time that he really ingrained himself into these guys' lives and then didn't really help them out all that much. I think he did do a couple of things, but Capote was a very wealthy man for the most part and could have done more, is what people are saying. But, you know, that's a whole mixed bag of things we're not going to get into. So there are some criticisms about the accuracy and about his role and everything that transpired during this whole process. So that's going to be my review of In Cold Blood by Truman Capote. If you liked it, please give it a big thumbs up and comment down below if you've read this nonfiction novel before. Anything else you want to say about this novel, leave it down below and we can get a discussion going and talk about this book even more. And I will talk to you guys next time.